A weird day, I think that's the description Terry gave it a little earlier in the program on the Senate story. The government blocks a key witness from the accounting firm Deloitte from appearing before a Senate committee to answer questions about whether he had tried to massage or even question the firm's audit of Mike Duffy's expenses. That's raised eyebrows and questions. What should we make of it? Everyone's here at the table tonight. Andrew, what should we make of it?
It's incredible. Step back from this. This is the auditing firm, Deloitte, that does the audits for the Conservative fundraising arm. They also are the recipient of millions of dollars in federal contracts. They're given this contract to investigate Mike Duffy's expenses by the Tory-dominated committee. There's all kinds of interference reported in the RCMP doc where they're calling them up to ask them about how it's going. They're trying to influence it. Duffy's not talking to them, etc. At the center of it is this fellow, Michael Runia, who was the point man, the contact with Senator Gerstein. We hear during today's testimony from the three auditors involved in the audit that he was, in fact, making these very inappropriate calls to them. They had to cut him off. And just when you think, okay, that's the next step, clearly they'll call him as the next witness, they have a vote and vote not to call him. It's staggering. You cannot believe they would be that brazen about it.
All right. You referred to what was in the documents last week. Let me just show you one of the documents that refers to the auditors, and this one's from Patrick Rogers, the PMO Manager of Parliamentary Affairs. Senator Gerstein has just called. He agrees with our understanding of the situation, and his Deloitte contact agrees. That's Runia. The senator will call back once we have Deloitte locked in. Now, that phrase got everybody interested in this angle of the story. We should mention that in the end of the story, nothing was done to the audit. No, there were no inappropriate, the ethical wall wasn't breached, says Deloitte.
So Deloitte says.
Right. What do you make of this?
But the issue isn't Deloitte, really. It's how the government is or not handling transparency. And at this point, it's brazen, certainly, but it's also tone deaf in the sense that it's clear that the strategy is to try to suck as much oxygen out of this story as possible to make it go away by not feeding it. But the story is no longer who said what to whom. The RCMP took care of that. The story is how the government is reacting to it. And it's tone deaf to one message delivered this week in by-elections, which is that they look like they're covering up. So either they're tone deaf, or else they have so much to cover up that they have to use their majority to make sure that it doesn't go any further.
All right, we'll get to by-elections a little later, but Bruce, where are you on this?
Well, I think, Peter, if there's a risk that people are tired of all of the different unpleasant things coming out in this story and that they miss this element of it, they really should pay attention. There really is a story that's worth exploring a bit more here. I think it was disappointing that Mr. Runia chose not to appear before the committee. I think it's disappointing that Senator Gerstein has chosen not to answer direct questions. These are the latest two people centrally involved in this really bad mess who decided that the best course of action for them is to avoid transparency. Those are poor decisions that they're making, and for the firm Deloitte, which has long enjoyed, I think, quite a sterling reputation, the questions go to, should they have accepted this assignment, sole source, from the Conservative-dominated Senate in the first place? Because there is a question not just of actual conflict, but perceived conflict. Could they be judged independently to have done the kind of job that people deserve to have done in this situation? I think we should hear from both of those people before we conclude on that.
One of the arguments being used by some of the senators today is, look, it's not for us to question them, it's for the RCMP to question them. Let them do this work.
Well, there's no reason why you can't do both, first of all. There's things short of criminal wrongdoing that are involved here. It's not, I don't think it's criminal wrongdoing to call up an auditor. It's just really, really improper. Secondly, we're assured that from the government side that the only two people being investigated by the RCMP are Nigel Wright and Mike Duffy. So then why can't we have questions from Irving Gerstein or from any of these other people?
This is an increasingly common answer that we're hearing from the government on a lot of questions now, which is that, well, only two people are under investigation, so why are you even bothering to ask about all of the other people who were involved in nefarious activities by all accounts, by most accounts, and are still on the public payroll? It's not an acceptable answer, I think, for most voters.
It's also a question of trust to the Tory base and the people who give money to the Conservative fund. The Prime Minister still has confidence in his chief fundraiser, Senator Gerstein, but surely there is a bit of a cloud over him, over the sense that he might have wanted to pay some of those expenses that Mike Duffy claimed wrongly. And there are emails that the RCMP put forward that suggest that this would have been kept secret from anyone, not made public. At some point, you might want, if you still deserve the trust of the Prime Minister, to show to people who give to the Conservative Party that you deserve that trust.
And what does it say about, again, our democratic institutions? So here we are 6 months later, and we still have not heard more than 5 words from Herb Gerstein. We have not been able to get any of these people under oath or in front of a committee.
Well, he did hear more than 5 words at the convention, but
right, in a speech, but he's not responding to any questions.
But even in a speech, he said I had nothing to do with this and would have no truck or trade with this. The RCMP has brought forward emails that suggest otherwise.
Yeah, I think he said he turned down the $90,000 request and didn't really talk about the $30,000 one, and that's part of the issue. I want to move down the hall from the Senate to the House of Commons now, where today you had Paul Calandra answering questions on behalf of the Prime Minister. He's his parliamentary secretary. He's not a cabinet minister. Used to be a day when deputy prime ministers or other cabinet ministers spoke on behalf of the Prime Minister when he was away. But nevertheless, he speaks on his behalf. And today, I just want to show you a response he gave to questions from Thomas Mulcair. Watch this.
Of course, the Leader of the Opposition lives at Stornoway. He has a residence in Montreal. It would be inappropriate for him to claim his residence in Montreal as a secondary residence and collect a per diem when he's living at Stornoway, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure he doesn't do that. That's why we wanted to stand up for the taxpayers and maintain that exact same standard, Mr. Speaker.
All right. I'm not sure what that actually, it had actually nothing to do with the question that he'd been asked, I think, by another NDP MP. But nevertheless, is that sort of like, is that a little breach of, was that innuendo acceptable?
No. Every day, Paul Calandra takes this further and further into the mire. Previously, he was known for giving completely non-answers on a scale we've never seen before in question. The question period has always been notorious for not really answering the question, but you were supposed to at least approximate it. Here we're getting serious questions, factual questions about serious matters of wrongdoing in the highest offices of government, and we're getting answers about the Grey Cup. And now we're getting, in the last couple of days, these wild accusations sprayed around the chamber about how supposedly, 3/4 of the Liberal caucus was under RCMP investigation, this innuendo about Tom Mulcair. And of course, what they're trying to do there is twofold. One is, by the sheer nonsensical nature of his answers, he's trying to knock the whole question of sense or reason out of the park as being any kind of criterion to hold him to. But secondly, it's the opposition's slinging mud, so we'll sling mud back. So we'll equate documented things from an RCMP investigation with whatever enters Paul Calandra's head at that moment. It's disgraceful.
The leader of the Green Party got up today, Elizabeth May, at the end of question period, raising a question of privilege about this whole issue of the way questions are responded to, the kind of answers they're getting, which are really usually questions back at the opposition. Here's the exchange she had with Peter Van Loan on this point.
I think it's objectionable, Mr. Speaker, under our rules, this isn't a point of debate I submit to you, to put questions to opposition members as a guise for evading the questions that are put properly to members of the governing party. Thank you, Mr.
Speaker. As you know, it is not the practice of you under the rules to regulate the quality of answers, in fact, not even the quality of questions. But it is a long-time rhetorical device, of course. In many cases, the best answer to a question is a question that poses and it illustrates the difficulties with the question that were posed and the inconsistencies. So, Mr. Speaker, I think, as you know, this is well beyond your jurisdiction to get into assessing the quality of the various answers.
Wow, you kind of wonder after that, like, what's the role of everybody there, and what's the role of question?
The good news is that increasingly the Conservative members around the people answering the questions or giving the explanations are, if not looking embarrassed, at least looking elsewhere, which goes to show that they are not beyond embarrassment. But after how many weeks of this? First, there is no rule that a senior minister should not answer questions when the Prime Minister is away. This is a first. And second, of all of the shifts made over the summer, possibly this was a very bad call to appoint this MP as parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister, because when we sit here talking about it, it is not a good sign.
First.
Well, I'm like Andrew. I started watching Question Period in 1978. I think I started working on the Hill then. In all the time since then, I watched pretty regularly. I've never seen anything sadder than what Paul Calandra is doing in the House. It's almost as though the Conservative Party's political gyroscope has fallen off the table and smashed to bits. Because not only is this not helping them, this is hurting them. Their partisans are unhappy with what they're seeing. And I think many people on their benches in the House of Commons are pretty unhappy, pretty embarrassed with what they're seeing. I think the idea of the Speaker intervening is an interesting question, but really what the Speaker would have to do would be to rule out of order an entire political strategy, not just one answer or the construct of one answer. And on the specific question of what Mr. Calandra was insinuating about Mr. Mulcair, there's a simple way to do this. He should walk out of the House and he should repeat the allegation or the quasi-allegation if he believes that there's merit to it and see what happens.
You know, you watch the Van Loan answer and you almost wonder, well, like, what is the role of the Speaker if he has no say in anything on either the question or the answer?
Well, and they've said this before, of course. Remember back in the spring when the question was, you know, should the Speaker have any role in deciding who gets to ask questions or make statements? And the government just said, you have no role whatsoever. Now, the Speaker backed them up on that and said, yes, I do have a role. In this case, it's a bit more problematic. I agree with Bruce that you'd have to get, I don't think the Speaker wants to get out in front of the House. That you need to get to the culture of the House to agree that the Speaker will be able to not just rule that questions are out of order, which he has done, but also that answers were just not even remotely relevant to the question. In other Houses of Parliament, in other Westminster systems, the Speaker can and does do that. We've allowed the Speaker's role, just as we've allowed everything else to degrade in our system, we've allowed the Speaker to become a very weak position, certainly if you took Peter Van Loan's logic. We
only see the to and fro, but if you're sitting in the House watching when, you know, Stephen Harper is answering Thomas Mulcair and people are laughing at the answers, the pressure on the Speaker from the Conservative bench to do something about that, to intervene. This is a Speaker that is under considerable pressure from a government bench that is obviously not having a very pleasant time since the House came back, and sometimes, you know, they're barking at the moon as they look at the Speaker. And it is also a fairly junior Speaker that we have. It is possible that someone with more experience, Peter Milliken when he was there, someone who'd been there for years and had the confidence of every party, would have more authority than a Speaker who still has, you know, quite a few years to put in before he's considered senior and exists only because the majority vote for him so the Conservatives can have him out.
All right. Rex is away this week, but split as they were beforehand. 2 Conservatives, 2 Liberals. Sounds like nothing really changed. Bruce?
Well, I think actually a lot of things changed underneath the surface. In terms of the chemistry, the psychology of the parties, I think each party took something important and not always pleasant away from those situations. I think for the Conservatives, I think they learned that their record isn't enough. They know that it isn't always about the economy. They've got a situation right now where there are almost 2 camps inside the Conservative Party. There's the camp that says, look, we probably need a message that sounds a little bit more like we get the message where we're going to work harder, we're going to try to do better. And then there's another camp that says, we're perfect, you're scum. And the we're perfect, you're scum gang is in charge right now, but I don't know how much longer they're going to be in charge. It feels like there's some restiveness there.
You agree with that? Is there real restive?
Yes, and I think when you see how hard it was, I think that the ground game of the Conservatives won the Manitoba ridings this week. If they didn't have, and the Liberals in Manitoba, as you know, do not have much of a machine, but if they had had a bit more organization to get their vote out, they would have lost those seats. And nothing speaks to caucus members more than the notion of a safe seat going away, because that could be their seat. And it's the second time. Remember the election in Calgary, the by-election last year? The numbers were good enough to elect a Conservative, but the Liberal vote was way up. But there were other lessons, and one of those goes to the NDP, and it is that when people decide to leave the Conservatives, they don't go to the NDP. And it's not a leader's issue, it's a brand issue. And how you get around that, I don't know. And it's not even a Quebec issue, because I would argue that the Quebec thing was overall totally meaningless, unless you want to argue that a riding where Stéphane Dion did better in his date and Justin Trudeau this week is really significant, which I don't think anybody would want to argue.
It's interesting that you put it that way, that it's a brand issue, not a leader issue, because if there's one thing that most people have agreed on, you've even heard conservatives talk about it, is that Tom Mulcair's looked really good on this story in the last 6 months, but he didn't get anything out of Monday night.
As we always say, there's 2 years to the next election. This was this night. Now, I don't think you can just wish away what happened this night. It was a terrible night for the Conservatives across the board in all 4 ridings. It wasn't just that they were scraping out a win in a riding in Brandon-Souris where they usually win by 30 or 40 points. But in Toronto Centre, they had the worst result for a Conservative candidate ever since Confederation. In Bourassa, they were near their very worst. So they were taking a beating across the board. It's absolutely true that on that night, at this moment, people who wanted to register a vote against the Conservatives went to the Liberals rather than the NDP, and that's got to be very troubling for them at the moment. I think what the NDP would tell themselves is 2 years from now, the question is going to be who do you want to form a government, not who do you want to register a protest. And I think they've still got some work to do to convince people that not only that they should throw Harper out, but that they should go to Mulcair as Prime Minister.
And who does well in the leaders' debate? Completely irrelevant in by-elections. They don't take place. But anyone who's watched the House of Commons would think that you would want to prep up Justin Trudeau for a leaders' debate big time before he steps up on the stage with Mulcair and Harper.
You've got 2 years now to prep for that. Got to leave it at that for tonight. Good extra time. We'll thank Rex.